This video is now in session, and yes, of course, practically all news, all types of news, and all types of commentary, including ours, is biased, has some amount of bias. Especially so, like literally, especially so right now compared to the news of just 2 decades ago. But the thing is, it's not actually bad for news organizations to admit that they have a bias. In fact, it should be normal that you have some sort of bias, and it should be normal for news organizations to have some amount of bias. In fact, if there is a news organization that doesn't that says that they don't have any bias, then that's actually pretty worrying, because a lot of times that just means that they're lying. Biases are always going to occur in every single news channel, from BuzzFeed to CNN to ABC to CBS to Breitbart to BBC to any news around the world. But the thing is, in terms of a bias, the news should have a bias, but in one particular thing, especially in America, which is defending democracy. For a lot of these news organizations, we currently treat them as if they have a bias towards the left or towards the right, but they should really have a bias towards democracy, because a democracy, in order for the news to survive, you must have a functioning democracy. In order to have a free press, you must have a democracy, and without the free press, you don't have any democracy. The democratic values start to be ignored because of the press. So it's important for these news organizations to have a bias towards democracy, and it's not wrong and it's not incorrect to say, or it is somewhat wrong to say that the news should not have any bias at all, or should not have a bias towards democracy, because a democracy is how they function. It's how they're able to survive. It's how fringe sites like the Daily Wire are able to survive, while the same amount of survival as like ABC News or NBC or the Associated Press or even PBS. So they if they have bias towards democracy, then that gives them some reason to actually report, because these days news is becoming more than just reporting fact. These days, news is also becoming a place for analysis by political pundits. And while we could go back to the days of just fact reporting and nothing more than that, a lot of times people don't want to hear that anymore. And we live in a capitalist society where profit is more important than trying to do the best thing possible. And as a result, a lot of news organizations are not going to go back to the original fact reporting that very few news organizations do today, like the Associated Press and Reuters. Places like CNN and as well as MSNBC have found that their audience wants to hear analysis by anchors and as well as commentators, which is why they get more views on average than places like CBS and as well as NPR and Politico as well as PBS. And that's why you don't really hear. That's why the best news anchors to be part of CNN, or not the best, but I mean the most well known, I should say. But the most well known anchors are usually at CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and you could potentially say. You could also potentially say NBC with Lester Holt, and as well as the Today Show. But the thing is, they are well known because of their analysis, because these networks kind of obviously skew one way or towards the other, but the main thing they should be skewing towards is democracy. If they skew for democratic values, that's the best way to acknowledge that they have a bias and satiate their need for a bias, while making sure that their news reporting is factual and is based on journalism and not just headlines that's meant to grab attention. Because if we move towards that direction of trying to have clickbait and trying to get the most amount of views as possible, then that truly is not a good sign for democracy, because you need a press that can do its job, that can hold people accountable and can show the truth in order to actually run this country and to keep people in power in check. That's how we know. It was partially because of the Washington Post and news organizations that we knew that Richard Nixon was a crook during Watergate. That's how we know that even outside of politics, that's how we know Jeffrey Epstein committed a lot of crimes, a lot of sexual abuse towards women. It was because of news organizations that had their allegiance towards democracy and had a sort of bias. So with that, it's time that we start to throw away the idea that news organizations can't have bias, because these days we're moving more towards an analytical side of journalism rather than a purely factual based journalism, and as a result that invites some amount of bias. So you have to have some kind of bias in your reporting. But if you have a bias towards democracy, then that can ensure that your news reporting is the best possible, and that you actually have that Americans actually have confidence in these news organizations. Because if CNN simply says that they don't have a bias at all and that they are the most trusted name in journalism without giving any context, then that makes them seem dishonest, because obviously CNN has a bias. But if CNN instead said that they had a bias towards democracy, and if they had a bias towards democracy, then that would make them a lot more favorable to the public, and that would restore the confidence of the institutional side of journalism that has been lost throughout these couple of years because of the rise of fake news and as well as alternative facts, in addition to the biases of these networks. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.